I assume most of you have heard the story of stone soup, the fable, the ancient wives' tale, perhaps. But I heard it recently, and I heard it in such a new way that I thought I would share it with you again, even though I know that many of you know the story. There was a village in which people didn't trust each other, a village where people were afraid of everyone else, a village where people built walls and fences to protect themselves from everybody, and nobody shared with anyone. One day, a stranger walked into town, an old woman, and with her she carried a big burlap bag. And she went from house to house asking if anybody had anything to eat. Not a single person shared with the stranger. So she went to the city square and she reached into her bag, and people were afraid. What's in there, they wondered. Is it a bomb? Is it something that she's going to hurt us with? And she pulls out some wood. She lights the wood, and people become increasingly afraid. Is she going to burn our town down? Is our village going to be no more? Who is this stranger that has a different color skin and wears this thing on her head that none of the women around our village ever wear? And she probably has some other religion, and how can we trust anybody like this? We don't know anything about her. Well, after she lights the fire, she pulls out of the burlap bag a big soup pot. She fills it with water and puts it on the fire, and she puts a stone in it. Everyone's watching her with suspicion, and she just pulls out a ladle and stirs it. Eventually, a young boy comes up to her and says, "Lady, what are you doing?" And she said to him, "I'm making the most delicious soup you will ever have in your life." And the young boy said, "Oh, I love soup. I haven't had delicious soup in so long because my family is so poor." And she said, "Well, it's going to be ready soon, but it needs a couple of onions." And the little boy's eyes got really big, and he said, "Onions? We have onions at my house. I'm going to go grab a couple of them because we can't possibly use them all." So the little boy went home and asked his parents, and they were a little begrudging of the fact that this stranger asked their young boy to bring some of their precious onions, but he begged, and they finally let him have the onions. And so he went back to the lady and said, "Here, there's 2 onions for the soup." So the lady put the onions in the soup and stirred it some more, and eventually a young girl came by and had pretty much the same conversation, but instead of onion, she said, "The soup just needs some potatoes." And she said, "Potatoes? That's what my family has. That's about all we have, but we've got plenty of them. Let me go get some potatoes." And so she comes back, and they dump the potatoes in the soup, a whole armful of them. And the lady just stirs it a little bit more, and eventually a young man walks up and says, "What are you guys doing here?" And she said, "Oh, we're making the most delicious soup in the world. It does need, however, some carrots." And he said, "Carrots? I've got tons of carrots." And he runs home and he brings some carrots and dumps a bag full of carrots in the soup. Pretty soon, a young woman comes by, and the same conversation, and the stranger says to the young woman, "We just need a little bit of celery." And of course she says, "Celery, I've got celery." And as the story goes on, there's this pot full of all these wonderful things. It just needs a little bit of salt. And this very old woman, who is the poorest person in town, walks up with her cane and says, "What's going on here?" And the stranger says, "We are making the most delicious soup you will ever taste. All it needs now is just a little bit of salt." And the lady said, "That's all I have to my name, just a little bit of salt." She reaches into her pocket, pulls out a bag, and throws some salt in the big pot. And the stranger just stirs it a bit longer, and after a while, pours a bowl for herself, takes a sip, and said, "This indeed is the most delicious soup I have ever had in my life." And she shares it with the entire village, and everyone agrees it's the most delicious soup they have ever had in their life. And it's not just because it's such good soup, but because they all participated, all the love that went into the soup. Now, when I was at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Toronto just a few weeks ago, a man by the name of Ibu Patel told this story. And when he first told it, I thought, oh, I've heard this so many times. I wonder if there's going to be some kind of twist on it. But he told the story just kind of how I'd heard it before. But what really grabbed me was the passion in which he told the story and the interpretation. Because at the very end, when he finished telling the story, he said, I want you to hear something really important. The village is the world that we live in right now. And he invited us to think about all the ways that people distrust each other in our country and in our world. All of the ways in which people act like they don't really have much of anything at all when we live in this world of abundance, and most of us are far wealthier than our parents or grandparents or great-grandparents. And he basically made me think about all the different things that I have that I take for granted, and also the different ways that when I turn on the news, I see the village everywhere in our world, not just in our country, but in the entire world, where people distrust people who are different. They're afraid, and as soon as somebody new shows up with an idea that's different, rather than saying, wonderful, what can I learn from this, we immediately step back and at least keep a little bit of distance, and at worst, build fences and walls to keep us away from people who are different. In this morning's gospel passage from the Gospel of Mark, Jesus gathered his disciples together right after a very unique mission trip that he had sent them on. He basically, before the passage that we read this morning, that Rosemary just read for us, Jesus got the 12 disciples together, paired them all off, and said, I just want you to go to all these different villages, all over Galilee. And I'll just tell you that many of those villages were much like the village in the story of Stone Soup. What was really interesting in Mark's gospel, however, is Jesus doesn't tell us, at least through Mark's voice, what the disciples told people or what they did. Mark just tells us how they traveled. And I'm just going to tell you, they traveled without any luggage, without any baggage, without packing at all. Now, I'm going to tell you, I used to travel every single week as a consultant to churches and nonprofit religious organizations. And my weekly schedule, week after week after week, went something like this. Either Sunday afternoon, but typically Monday morning, very early, I would go to the airport and I'd travel somewhere in the country, and I would be with a church or a religious organization, and I would consult with them for a day or two, and then I would pack my bags and travel somewhere else. And usually after 2 or 3 clients, I would go home by Friday afternoon. I had packing down to a science. I figured if I had to do it so much, I was just going to do it as quickly and as efficiently as possible, and I could almost do it blindfolded. I just knew what I needed, and I had my little suitcase and my bag that I had all my paperwork in, so that when I got to the airport, the destination, I didn't even have to check in any luggage. I just grabbed my stuff and went to my client or did whatever I needed to do in terms of my meetings, and it was really smooth and easy for me to do the work I needed to do. So when I read in Mark's gospel that Jesus told the disciples not to pack, all of a sudden I felt my blood pressure rising more than just a little, as I imagined what that would be like to go somewhere where I'd never been before on some kind of mission, and I'm not supposed to pack a thing. Jesus told the disciples, don't bring any food. I thought, oh my gosh, right then I would just have to say, no thanks, this trip isn't for me. But no meals, can you imagine? No snacks, No extra clothes, not an extra pair of shoes, nothing whatsoever. His message was, just go right now. Go and preach the good news. Heal people and cast out demons. Do whatever it is that people need, but don't pack a thing. And so the disciples had gone on this mission trip with faith and the instructions, just go. In this morning's gospel lesson, they had just returned. And let me just tell you, they must have been very, very, very hungry and very, very, very tired. And so Jesus, being the wise teacher that he was, said, let's go to a place away from everybody else. Let's get away from the crowds and just rest and eat. And you can imagine the disciples just saying, thank you, Jesus. However, unbeknownst to them, there were some people that saw them sneaking away to be by themselves, and they rushed there ahead of time. So when Jesus and the 12 disciples got to the place where they were supposed to rest and eat, there were literally thousands of people. So Mark tells us that there were 5,000 men. And most likely, many of those men had wives, and many of those couples had kids. There was probably tens of thousands of people waiting to be served in one way or another. And you can imagine the disciples' attitude when they saw that. This was their time. This was time for the disciples to rest and eat and replenish. And all of a sudden, Jesus had compassion on the crowd and was there for them. He healed them. He taught them. And the disciples were thinking, well, so much for lunch. But when it got close to dinner time, they finally thought, somebody's got to say something to Jesus. And so they go over and I don't know if they whispered in his ear or they just all shouted at him together, but it's like, Jesus, send these people away so they can get something to eat. But I think their real MO is send these people away so we can eat. They had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. That was supposed to be their lunch, and here it is dinner time now. And so Jesus just looked at them and said, you feed them. Can you imagine the disciples with their 5 loaves of bread and their 2 fish? And they had this little argument with Jesus, and he basically just said, sit them all down and just start feeding them. And lo and behold, everyone ate, including the disciples. And they ate so much that everyone was full, and when they were done, there was still food left over. Now, this story in Mark's gospel is also told in all the other gospels, and it's such an important story because the message really is, no matter how big the problem seems to be, no matter how big the crowd happens to be, it's never too big to act with compassion and with kindness. There is no problem too big that we stop acting with compassion and kindness. And so Jesus taught his disciples back then and all of us a very important lesson. You know, when I listen to the news or read the newspaper or sometimes just look around me, I think the problems in this world are so big. What difference can I make? And it's really important that I don't just stop showing compassion and kindness because the problems seem too big. Because whether you're looking at the story of Stone Soup, or you're looking at this particular gospel lesson, or any of the gospel lessons, over and over and over again, we see that when we act with kindness and compassion, it makes a big, big difference. So Eboo Patel, who told the story at the Parliament of the World's Religions, by the way, he's the founder and director of an interfaith organization called Interfaith Youth Corps based out of Chicago, Illinois. And he was one of the best speakers, I think, at the entire conference. He was one of those people that I thought it was worth going to Toronto just to hear him alone. Anyway, he said, it's important to realize not only that the village is our world right now, but there's a certain kind of leadership that we see in the stranger in the story. And as he described the kind of leader that she was, I kept thinking, that's who Jesus was. And that's who Jesus calls us to be. He said, first of all, this stranger had a new vision where other people just saw hunger, too big of a problem, the inability to trust. When they just saw a crowd, the lady, the stranger, saw a community. And Ibn Battuta said, in every case where the world really changes because a leader makes a difference, they see a new vision. They see community where other people just see a crowd of strangers. He also said that the woman was able to see that every single household had a contribution to make. It wasn't just the rich people. It wasn't just the people who had a lot. And in the story, you'll remember that there was a man with a whole bag full of carrots. And there was an old woman who had just a little tiny handful of salt. I'll tell you, if you have ever had soup without any salt or herbs or spices at all, you know how important that salt is. And one of the messages that you often hear in church is that every household, every single person makes a difference. Whatever it is that you can bring, your gift makes all the difference in the world. And it's so important in our world where people are excluded and where people are not invited and people are on the margins and they're ignored, that we include everybody in this message of God's love, of compassion, and of kindness. So it's important to know that Jesus also was that leader who had that vision. He saw community. He saw love and trust. He also saw that every household and every single person had something to offer that was really, really, really good. As I listened to Ibn Patel tell the story of what the world needs now in terms of leaders, I kept thinking that, Jesus basically led in this way that Ibn Patel kept talking about, and he invited each and every one of his followers to also lead in that same way. And whether you think of yourself as a leader or not, if you follow Jesus, we have a vision of a world where kindness and compassion makes a difference and everybody's included. The world's problems seem awfully big, I know that. But you have no idea what the ripple effect is when you show kindness or compassion to even one other person. Jesus changed the world by doing that and invites us to continue doing the exact same thing. Show kindness. Show compassion. Most likely, you will never ever see the wonderful effects of that kindness and compassion will make. One act of kindness and compassion can circle the globe. You won't see that probably in your lifetime. And sometimes I wonder if heaven is actually a time where we get to see just what a huge difference our kindness and compassion makes, especially during those times where people are losing hope, where people are giving up, where people are thinking that the world's problems or the nation's problems or the political problems or the church's problems are too big. Just imagine what it would be like if we could all truly see that one single act of kindness and compassion circles the entire globe, because it does. It really does. Amen.